The ancient Greeks understood the concept of identity as a paradox, and we haven't been able to correct their views ever since. Instead, like the Greeks, for the purpose of everyday life, we pretend there is no paradox in the idea of identity. And for the pretense, some of us pay a hefty price tag. Take this house as an example. The owner wanted to build an apartment building in its place, but the city forbade it due to building codes in the neighborhood that required the preservation of the original structure because of its historical significance. While the owner can build a garage underneath the existing house and an apartment building in the backyard, the old and termite-eaten dwelling must stay. The contractor suggested it would be cheaper and easier to demolish the entire house and rebuild it on the top of the finished garage, guaranteeing an identical replacement. However, the law says the old house must be preserved, so they dug a hole under the house, installed a steel post beam structure, and raised the house several feet to make space for the concrete work. Then they lowered it on the top of the finished garage to remodel it. This elaborate operation is necessary because it is the answer that Western civilization gives to the ancient paradox of the Ship of Theseus.
According to legend, Theseus, the mythical Greek founder-king of Athens, had saved the children of Athens from King Minos after slaying the Minotaur and then escaped on a ship to Delos. Every year, the Athenians commemorated this legend by taking the ship on a pilgrimage to Delos to honor Apollo. The question posed by ancient philosophers was this: after several centuries of maintenance, if every part of the Ship of Theseus had been replaced, one at a time, was it still the same ship?
Heraclitus denied that anything can be identical to what it has been or will be, because everything is constantly changing. Parmenides argued the other way around. He thought that permanence is the fundamental characteristic of reality, that everything is identical to itself and that all changes are illusions because everything is one and the same. However, building inspectors would say that replacing one plank would not compromise the ship's identity. It is still the Ship of Theseus. Replace another plank and the ship will still be the same. And so on till the last piece and beyond. The ship is the same just like the house is, as long as it is not built anew from scratch. Now consider the scenario where the carpenters kept and put the old planks back together like before. We now have two ships, the one that had been remodeled piece by piece, and the one that had all the original parts. Which is the Ship of Theseus? We can't give a definitive answer because something is missing from the equation. The missing ingredient is found in the sorcerer's description of the world. The ship's identity hinges not on its material components, but on the intent we imbue it with. The Ship of Theseus is a paradox only from a material point of view. But for now, let us sail to the White House and use it as a lighthouse to illuminate the obscure phenomenon of intent. Suppose the President of the United States needs more office rooms than the historic White House can offer, so they decided to build a multi-story building in the exact location, and the government donated the old mansion to a nursery school in Arkansas. Now, which one is the White House? Is the one in Arkansas, with the original building material, or the modern glass cube where the president resides? To answer this question, we need to understand what the White House is. The White House is the symbol of the American presidency, the center of all of our endeavors, hopes, demands, and expectations as Western citizens. For us, the White House is for all practical purposes the capital of the world. These are not physical properties. Therefore, changing the building would not alter the power of the American presidency. A white neoclassical mansion or a modern steel and glass cube makes no difference. So, where is the White House? It is not in Arkansas, but not in Washington, D.C. either.
It is certainly not in our perception, not even in our thoughts, but in a special realm of intending, where it is nurtured with everything pertinent to it.
Let's unpack this quotation. It is certainly not in our perception. Our sensory experiences have no role in determining the location of the White House. Even if we visited the building, touched the walls, and smelled the paint, we wouldn't collect any meaningful information about the location of the White House we are after. Not even in our thoughts. The White House is not a mere thought. It is way more powerful than any thought can be. Therefore, it is not the content of the mind. It exists in a special realm of intending. This special realm is not physical, nor psychological, but an energetic dimension. And we don't have a word for it because it is not part of Western cognition, where it is nurtured with everything pertinent to it. We actively maintain the intent of the White House with our hopes, fears, wishes, anticipations, complaints, worries, and so on. And the White House is not the only thing we create this way. Pretty much everything, including the Ship of Theseus. The Athenians didn't maintain the ship's identity by replacing rotten planks. They preserved it by incorporating the myth of Theseus into the city's laws, religion, and culture. The ship was an integral part of their everyday lives, as seen in Plato's Apology, where Socrates' execution was delayed until the ship returned from its pilgrimage to Delos. Every citizen in Athenian society helped maintain the ship's identity by celebrating its pilgrimage, obeying the law, following the moral code, and worshipping Apollo. Fear, hope, respect, and belief maintained the ship's identity, not the wooden components. Let's peek into this process with another excerpt from the book Magical Passes.
Don Juan Matus stated that human beings as organisms perform a stupendous maneuver of perception which, unfortunately, creates a misconception, a false front. They take the influx of sheer energy in the universe at large and turn it into sensory data, which they interpret according to a strict system of interpretation that sorcerers call the human form. This magical act of interpreting pure energy gives rise to the misconception, the peculiar conviction of human beings that their interpretation system is all that exists. Don Juan elucidated this phenomenon with an example. He said that the tree, as a tree is known to human beings, is more interpretation than perception. He pointed out that for human beings to establish the presence of a tree, all they need is a cursory glance that tells them hardly anything. The rest is a phenomenon that he described as the calling of intent, the intent of tree. That is to say, the interpretation of sensory data pertaining to the specific phenomenon that human beings call tree. He declared that the entire world of human beings, just as in this example, is composed of an endless repertoire of interpretations where human senses play a minimal role. In other words, only the visual sense touches the energy influx which comes from the universe at large, and it does so only in a cursory fashion. To create a total universe of intending in such a manner is our magic.
So perceptual details don't matter in the making of our world. Anything goes as long as it calls the intent of a tree, a ship, the White House, and everything else. When the Athenians looked at the ship or talked about it, they called the ship's intent, and that's how they kept it alive and gave it its identity. They knew how to call it because the ship was part of their interpretation system, just like the White House is part of ours. But we don't know how to call the intent of the Ship of Theseus anymore, and not because we lost its physicality. We didn't lose the physicality of Stonehenge, and yet we don't know how to call its intent because we don't have the devotion, the fear, the hope and wonder and purpose that the ancient builders had for it. If the original Ship of Theseus were to be found preserved in the sand of Athens, it would be nothing more than a bunch of lifeless wood. We wouldn't be able to bring it to life and relate to it because we don't have the intent for it. Let's look at intent from another angle. Imagine standing before the Judgment of Paris in the National Gallery of London. You are looking at the three most beautiful women in ancient Greece: Aphrodite, Hera, and Athena. At least that's how Rubens rendered beauty with titillating intellectual content in the 1630s. Now, are you looking at the original painting? No, the original picture grabbed the viewer by the ball. It was voluptuous and lustful. The original painting was sensational. It would have been on the cover of Playboy magazine. This painting, however, you are looking at is rather dull, and these ladies are unattractive. The artwork doesn't affect today's viewers as Rubens intended. See what I mean? We lost the intent of the original picture because our ideals of beauty and sensuality have changed over time. And just because the experts point out these pigments were put on the canvas by the master himself, it doesn't prove anything other than that the experts are hardcore materialists. Rubens' original intention is not in the painting. Whatever he wanted to convey doesn't come through anymore, and the picture doesn't affect today's viewers as he meant it. Even the physical components of the painting have changed over the centuries with the aging of the paint. What you see in the National Gallery is a painting with a completely different intent. One that has more to do with the business interest of the art museum industry than Rubens' artistic vision. Suppose the sorcerer's description of the world is correct. The world is not the aggregation of independent physical objects, but a dream of intended reality. In that case, it is easier to accept that identity is not an intrinsic attribute of reality, but rather a flexible construct, subject to perception.